camera is very grainy, and turns out my voice is higher on camera than I thought it was, and also when I look back at this recording, my face is flipped. So this is hell on earth recording this video. But I read Interview with the Vampire, and I desperately need to talk about it. My family's already trying to kill me, so I thought I would do a video essay. That way I could edit out all the bad parts and just give you the good parts to look at. So I was going to do a normal video essay, but then I was like, why don't you just make this unbearably awkward for everybody watching and make it a vampire mukbang instead? So the main antagonist, Lestat, he does this thing where he'll like take a rat and then he'll crack it open over a wine glass and drink its blood. And in the book, it's like a pretty kind of romantic, a little violent, but like, you know, it's pretty fun. And now that I'm saying it out loud, I realize how creepy this sounds. But you know what? We're gonna do it. Except I'm vegan. I'm sorry. And then also I don't have access to rats in my everyday life. So we're gonna try something else and make it work. I should warn you, don't try this at home. Stabbing Furbies is a guaranteed way to get killed, but honestly, third quarter's really been hard. Also, Furbies don't bleed. It smells like iced coffee, but will we really ever know? Don't kill Furbies. Anyways, that was unbearably painful to watch, so let's actually talk about Interview with the Vampire. So, I read Interview with the Vampire by Anne Rice, which was published in 1976, and is the first book of the series called The Vampire Chronicles. And the second book, The Vampire Lestat, would be published like a decade later, so I should probably research whether or not it was always supposed to be a series, but I do know that Interview with the Vampire started out as a short story, which has a kind of similar but kind of different plot. I think Louis, our main protagonist, is a little bit more violent in that one, but yeah. I thought this would be funnier, but it's not. So basically the plot goes like this. So we have this guy who's only referred to as the boy, who does interviews with people. He like has a little tape recorder with him because it's the 70s, and he's like going around interviewing people. And he runs into this guy who says that he's a vampire, and he's like, sure, whatever, this will be an interesting interview. But things get started, and it's pretty obvious quickly that this guy who's interviewing, he's actually a vampire. This vampire's name is Louis, or I guess the vampire. The vampire's name is Louis, and for the rest of the book, we basically get Louis's tale of his life, which he starts out as a plantation owner in the late 18th century. Then he meets this hot vampire guy named Lestat, who turns him into a vampire, and then they have a couple years together. Eventually, their like vampire marriage starts falling apart, so Lestat, who is the main antagonist, turns this girl Claudia into a vampire. She's like literally 5 years old, which ends up causing problems for them later. Eventually, Claudia and Lestat get into a bunch of fights, and so Louis and Claudia leave for Europe and eventually Paris, where more shenanigans ensue, which I don't super want to talk about because kind of spoilers, before eventually Louis returns to New Orleans alone, and we get this interview that the book is written after, which is kind of fun. I'll talk more about specific plot points later, but basically all you need to know is that Louis is telling the story of his life, which mainly revolves around him, his creator Lestat, and then his and Lestat's child together, as much as vampires can have a child together, not talking about you sealing Edward and Bella. I found that at a thrift store. It was like totally a steal. But yeah, basically Louis telling the story of his life to this vampire. No, he's a mortal man. It's important that he's a mortal man because I am a mortal man, and I'm seeing Louis through the eyes of this narrator. Anyways, that's the base plot. So most of the story takes place in New Orleans, and there's a lot of reason for that. Louis loves New Orleans because it's like civilization surrounded by like weaves that are constantly encroaching on that, which is kind of a metaphor for like vampires in general. They're technically civilized, but their vampire nature is constantly encroaching on their ability to be human. And also, they're like the least, he and his little like trio. I'm going to call them the trio because I don't want to say Louis, Lestat, and Claudia all the time. So the trio are the least interesting people in New Orleans. And then eventually when he moves to Paris, it's mostly because Paris is like the mother of New Orleans, which is kind of fun. So, of course, we have our protagonist, Louis, and then the main antagonist, Lestat, even though I would argue Louis is just projecting because a lot of his conflict is internal, and also Lestat is just kind of a more interesting character, so that's kind of fun. Coffee is really good. Or, sorry, Furby blood. Anyways, a lot of Louis' conflict is internal, and we see this, he just is constantly questioning, what is he? Why does he exist? How can such evil be allowed to carry on? And, you know, what is Louis' main character trait? He's just sad all the time. But I guess, like, more than sad, it's really, like, unhappy. And I don't mean unhappy as, like, a synonym for sad. I mean unhappy as in whatever emotion he's feeling, it's never really happy. Even in moments when he is happy, he's like, and I knew something bad was coming, so I couldn't really be happy. To which I say, relatable. Okay, so let's talk themes, because there are a couple that are, like, really big. So first of all, there's religion and damnation, which this is like one of the first themes we get introduced to because it all starts when Louis was human, which we don't get a lot of when Louis was human, which is an interesting choice and kind of further proves that like Louis was always sad. But Louis basically had this brother Paul who wanted to be a priest, but died when Louis told him that he couldn't be, due to a couple of reasons that are too finite for me to get into. And ever since then, Louis has been really mad at God and religion, specifically because Paul's, like, overseeing priest basically betrayed him towards the end. And I think anyone who's had a bad experience with religion kind of knows that the scariest part is seeing how much power religion can hold over people. Yeah, it's really scary. And as I've started the next book in this series, it's pretty consistent there too, with the protagonist there also terrified of the power of religion, and specifically how religion can often be used to justify death or violence, which without a god, there is no like justification. There is no final. What is it like when like someone judging you? Judgment. There's no final judgment. Anyways, it's just really interesting to see this as a theme throughout the series overall and not just this book. And kind of in a way, the abusive power of religion killed Paul, which is why Louis went to Lestat in the first place. So in a way, religion killed Louis. That's kind of deep, though. Anyways, I lumped damnation in here because that seems to be Louis' line between mortals and immortals, or really himself and others, because he certainly loves to isolate himself, even from his vampiric companions. Louis, he's damned. He's emotional. He's different. And I roll my eyes a little bit because to what extent is this self-inflicted? Other vampires aren't as emotional as Louis is, and when he meets other vampires, they're like, wow, you're kind of a mess, Louis. Anyways, Louis doesn't do anything. He's kind of like a fairy tale or Hans Christian Andersen character, where he has things inflicted to him, which he reacts to, and he doesn't really do anything for himself. We see him always under someone else's care, and that is just really interesting. Throughout the whole book, Louis is basically questioning what good is, or even less than what is good, what is evil, because are they always a dichotomy? I don't know. Anyways, he knows that he's evil. That's like one of his few convictions in life, is that he knows he's evil. But what does that mean actually? And how does that change or not change if God's in the picture? Is evil universal without someone there to judge you? Food for thought. And eventually he decides, yes, in the absence of God or higher power, the only true evil is taking the one thing we have, which is life. Which is kind of interesting, that there can only be one true evil. Fascinating. And that touches on something larger that Rice kind of skirts around, which I'll go over later. Alludes to. I should be using proper vocabulary in this. I am being graded right now. So another theme that they talk about is love and relationships, which this book is very gay, and some people try to deny that, to which I say, can we just have queer love in this world? Like, oh my gosh, we have to fight this so hard. I mean, I was gonna make a compilation of gay quotes, but there were literally so many, and I forgot to take really good notes while I was reading. But for the next book, The Vampire Lestat, which I'll be doing a video on next time, I'm taking screenshots of, like, gay highlights, so I'll make sure to include that next time. But Anne Rice has come out saying that Louis and Lestat are gay. They talk about it in the book, being each other's lovers, and it just makes me really upset that people just refuse to admit gay people exist, let alone gay vampires. Anyway, that's a rant for another day. But I say this because the book mostly follows Louis in a same-sex relationship, first with his creator Lestat, and then eventually this other vampire guy, Armand. And even though none of the characters are explicitly intimate, the relationships mock that of a fruitless marriage. And knowing a little bit about Anne Rice, we see her almost reflected back as Louis, and I say almost as in really. Louis is Anne Rice's self-insert character, which makes me sad that Louis is sad, because Anne Rice is so cool and kind of like awesome. She's like the queen of the vampire community now. It really rocks, and she's less anti-Semitic than Bram Stoker was, so cheers to that. Yeah, so Anne Rice is Louis, and this would partially explain the nature of all the men in our protagonist's life. And I do know that she has a very interesting relationship with her gender, which is then reflected in her later books as she introduced more non-binary, gender non-conforming characters. So, anyways, if you love queer literature, I think honestly this series is really great. Anne Rice is huge within the LGBT community, and she's really open about her own gender and sexuality, as well as working with her gay author son, Christopher. In fact, right now they're working on an HBO series, so if you want to hop on the Vampire Chronicles train, like, now is the time. Anyways, I talk about Rice being a reflection, Louis being a reflection of Rice. Louis doesn't exist. Maybe. I hope so. Anyways, Rice was married and lost a daughter when the daughter was 5, and that would explain the closeness between Louis and his daughter/lover, Claudia, which, that's a topic. And I'm just gonna go right out there and say it. I have trouble analyzing the relationship between Louis and Claudia, and that probably makes me like a very shallow person, that I can't see past the fact that Claudia is in the body of a 5-year-old, but it just makes me really uncomfortable, and it does limit my ability to understand everything the book has to offer. But at the same time, do I necessarily want to actively defend a relationship between a grown man and a woman in a 5-year-old's body? No. Not that I would want to. I mean, I wish this book was perfect, but it's not, and I think Anne Rice really loves to kind of push the boundaries of love, and this is certainly one of those instances. Let's move on from that. So Rice introduces the idea of, can a monster love? Which sounds kind of basic at first, but I think she does it in a really cool way. And if a monster can love, does that mean that he's a monster? And how does love change and stay the same and mutate as we change as people? So we end up with this conclusion that love never really changes, but the way it manifests itself does. So for example, sexual love when you're human would turn into like a biting love when you're a vampire. And the line between types of love are blurred. So I know like it's like Greek or Roman culture where there's like 5 words for love, and Anne Rice is basically like, no. So this is where we get Ludia, is that their ship name? Louis and Claudia ending up more like lovers than a daughter and father, which is how they come across to the world. And in some cases, love mutates to hate, which Rice ends up saying are the same, and I love that so much. Or do I hate that so much? I like the idea that if you love something enough to hate it, then don't you really love it after all? It's really cool. Just like a heads up, weird romance stuff in the Vampire Chronicles is a really common theme. I mean, I think if I had to describe in like one word what's going on, gay, polyamorous, incestual vampires are really emo. That would be how I would describe this book. A fair warning, the next book gets really heavily into incest, and so if you're not into that, you're valid, but also you should read it anyways. I mean, just in general, the book is like really sexual, and every single review has something about it being super erotic, so And don't get me wrong, the book is literally amazing and I'm obsessed with it, and it's so jam-packed with action and romance, but I don't think I would be doing it justice if I didn't mention the parts that make me uncomfortable and that push me to my boundaries. So, yeah, it's an interesting book, and I think everyone should read it, but also there are some parts that are weird. So after that, let's talk about death, which is honestly the less weird one. So first of all, duh, it's a book about vampires. We're going to be talking about death. But when you take multiple lives a night, the concept of death is going to get brought up, and it would be kind of like bad to not use death as a theme in your book about vampires. But she does it in a really interesting way where it's less about death and more about beauty, immortality, and immortality, and how it's kind of like two sides of the same coin. That's a very obvious page flip. Louis is also constantly questioning who has the right to take life, which is again relating back to the God thing, and like, without a God, who can take life? Anne Rice does this really cool thing where a bunch of characters have answers to this question: why do we deserve to take life? Because, you know, they're vampires, they've probably dealt with their own existential crises before, and their answers are just perfect reflections of their characters. So, for example, Lestat, who's our antagonist, he dresses up fun, he really loves making a show out of his killings. He's very much self-centered and boisterous and glamorous, like very sexy, glamorous vampire characters, which we live for. Lestat claims that he's on par with God and therefore has every right to take life. Like, by being separated from God through vampirism, he therefore has every right that God has, which is so cool, super reflective of his character, is powerful and self-centered. And then we have this other vampire, Armand, who he was made during the Renaissance, so he's very much like art and beauty focused, and he sees death as art, as an inevitable end. In a way, it's kind of like offering peace, but more than that, it's like saying death knows your name, death knows you. Isn't that a wonderful way to go? Which is really interesting. It's cool to see really intentional choices in some of this stuff, especially after reading other vampire novels, which they're fine, but this is just kind of cool on a different level. So another theme is God versus Satan, and this one is huge. It's literally so important. Louis is constantly at war with God, sometimes hating him, loving him, or even just straight up ignoring him. There was this point on his ship where Louis was like, I'm not sure how I feel about God. I'm just not dealing with it today, which is a fat mood. Man, Louis really sees himself as a child of Satan for a long time because, like, Satan is the face of evil. And then one of the other vampire characters comes about and is like, didn't God create Satan? And basically sends him into an existential crisis, which I kind of think is justified, because that's a good question. If God created everything, God also created evil. Therefore, he created Louis. Therefore, he created all the evil things inside of us as the readers, which is really interesting. And a lot of the book is focusing on Louis coming to terms with the fact that there is no higher power, because how could anyone let the horrors of vampires exist? Like, they're literally terrifying and horrible and evil. Every vampire has claimed that they're evil. No vampire claims that they're good, which I think is a really interesting choice on Anne Rice's part, because I'm referencing to Twilight because that's pretty much my other, like, vampire series that I really enjoy, where Edward's little gang, Edward is like the main vampire character. His whole clan is focusing on being moral vampires, which Anne Rice is claiming is impossible, which is kind of cool, because isn't choosing damnation choosing only evil? Deep stuff here. Yeah, so basically, dealing with the fact that there is no God, it's depressing but really interesting. It makes you question, or at least it made me question, how would your life change if there was nothing afterwards? No final judgment, no repentance, no final smiting for those who have hurt others. And it's an idea that Rice uses in her next book as well, which is really cool, and in a more direct way than she does in this one. So if you like that idea, I would definitely recommend the series overall. So next we get to Anne Rice's next intentional choice, which is using vampires. It sounds kind of basic, but vampires are the perfect outcast, and that's kind of like the theme that I'm using here, is the theme of being an outcast, being an outsider. And the word just outcast is important here because, unlike other monsters, vampires always have to start out as mortal, unless of course you're Renesmee Coleman. If you can't tell, I'm looking over there because I have like a tapestry of Edward and Bella that hangs above my bed. Just super fast, stop making fun of Twilight. From one vampire fan to the world, it makes you look like an idiot. We get it, it's bad, but also, you know what? Shut up. And okay, people mock Edward for being sparkly, but Anne Rice wrote multiple times that Lestat glows in the dark, so you tell me which one is more cringy. Oh, my dad's calling me. Anyways, oh yeah, stop making fun of Twilight. We get it, Twilight is about abstinence culture, but if Twilight's just about abstinence, then The Vampire Chronicles is just smut, so stop. So anyways, because vampires were always mortal, we get this feeling of leaving and being left simultaneously, which has to be like the worst feeling ever, which it's powerful. It's a really powerful feeling. The idea that you have to leave but you don't want to. Isn't that so sad? Anyways, it's part of the reason why the vampire community and the queer community are a Venn diagram, if not just a circle. It's pretty synonymous. I was thinking about showing a bunch of memes here where I talk about like how the internet, vampires are gay basically, whether they want to be or not. The idea of choosing damnation. It's very reminiscent of some conservative Christian ideas about homosexuality. I mean, I'm a gay person who came from a conservative Christian community, and in choosing to live openly and not hate myself, my church believes I'm choosing hell. And that's fun, and not enough people talk about that. How I couldn't go back if I wanted to because I'm basically the devil now, which this is probably too open for this presentation, but I don't care. This book called me out in ways that are scary. But yeah, I mean, Rice's work is so powerful because without intentionally trying, she managed to capture this feeling that a lot of queer and formerly Christian queer people feel. Share a Tumblr post that it shared how universal this feeling is of vampires relating to gay people. And I mean, Louis wasn't living while human, and he was just sad, like a lot of closeted people are. And vampirism offered freedom and supernatural ability, but also being an outcast from the world that raised you. And that's really powerful. For a lot of people that come from unsupportive communities, coming out can be moving from one state of discomfort to another. And that's really hard. And Louis reflects this. He was unhappy before and he was unhappy now. We see Louis struggling with how to function in a society that he is removed from, with many characters telling him how, which is fun. Was Lestat working me through religious trauma? Hell yeah, pun intended. So here's a quote of me quoting Anne Rice. Anne Rice said herself that the vampire is an outsider. He's the perfect metaphor for those things. He's always on the margins. And honestly, as someone who recently left an influential community, Louis is 100% my new comfort character, lol. Rice makes intentional choices. New Orleans, being a society surrounded by wilderness, reflects vampires constantly fighting against their vampire nature. Louis is a slave owner, mocks the slave-like relationship he has with Lestat. Just the book being an interview, we are the interviewer. Since the actual interviewer is a nameless, faceless human who can just encapsulate the audience, and then just literally using vampires, creatures who always begin as normal humans. I mean, this is what makes the book so good. This is why you should read the book, because everything Anne Rice does is incredibly intentional. I'm going to analyze this one-off quote to show you why. So at this point in the story, Louis is like kind of just thinking, he's talking with someone else, and he's thinking about Lestat, his buddy. And this is just a one-off quote. Anne Rice doesn't go back into this anymore. This is just like an off-the-cuff thought that Louis thinks. What would Christ need have done to make me follow him like Matthew or Peter? Dress well, to begin with, and have a luxurious head of pampered yellow hair. Of course, this is Louis' inner monologue, and in case you didn't catch it, Lestat was known for his great taste and even better hair. Firstly, Louis is saying that he would follow Lestat as Peter follows Jesus, which Peter would eventually become the rock of the Christian church. He was like Jesus's right-hand man. But knowing a bit about the Bible, before Jesus like rises again from the grave, Peter betrays him 3 times before then becoming the rock of the church. And in this same way, Louis would eventually betray Lestat 3 times, which I'm not going to say what they are because kind of spoilers, but just know that, yeah, Louis definitely throws Lestat under the bus. But Lestat is also the perfect Christ. And in the Christian religion, Christ is the only way towards eternal life. And partly it's by taking Holy Communion, which is Jesus' blood. And Dylan, I know you're reading the Bible, so I am so sorry for this. But, duh! Lestat gave Louis eternal life through his own blood. But more than that, the relationship between creator and fledgling in the vampire community is some mix between master and slave, lovers and marriage, and just overall huge power imbalances, which from a religious perspective, the church, which remember like Peter was the rock or foundation of the church, is often referred to as the bride of Christ. Like it's so deep. And I mean, the connections here are incredible. I've talked before about Louis and Lestat being in a broken marriage, which again reflects like Rice is making a claim about religion here. If the broken relationship between Louis and Lestat is that of Peter and Jesus, first of all, Peter and Jesus were a little bit more freaky than I thought they were, but also the idea that the relationship between God and the church is broken, which eventually goes back to the idea of the Antichrist, someone who pretends to lead people to God but really isn't. Anyways, it's so deep. But then also relating back to vampire culture, victims of vampires are often referred to as their brides. Peter is a victim of Jesus. I mean, there's just so much, and this is from one 2-sentence quote. It's amazing. So I guess in conclusion, should you read the book? And I think despite some of its awkward parts, like, yeah, you should really read the book. And you should especially read it if you're feeling alone, abandoned, or used, because that's where Rice was coming from when she was writing it. And I think she's just a really great author, you guys. I mean, her intentional choices make it so every word that you're reading is important, and it's so hard to put it down because it's so good. You know how Mr. Ledoux was talking about like how you can get sucked into romance novels? This is like the perfect romance novel, but it's also drama, and it also like is dealing with the fact that we're alone in the universe, which is kind of a lot to handle at once, but the book does it really skillfully. I mean, Rice's book is about what to do without God. Whoa. And that is just so important. Because, okay, let's get real for a moment. Every issue is really just daddy issues with God and our creation and our purpose. And I will stand by that. Rice just slowly works through all these things. Like, what do we do without purpose, without intentional creation, and without divine justice? And I won't spoil the answers, but if you're struggling, I would read this book. I said earlier that Lestat was working me through religious trauma, and like I'm not even. I wish I was being ironic, but I'm not. He totally did. So, anyways, yeah, read it. I said before that they're making an HBO show, so like now's the time to hop on the Vampire Chronicles train. Not to mention, there's like a joke that like the Vampire Chronicles are like the Kardashians for the gays, and Kim and Kanye are getting a divorce, so time to read up. Anyways, I'll be back in a week or so with my thoughts on the next book, which already, it's called The Vampire Lestat. Already, I like it a lot more. I think Lestat's just a more interesting character, and this one is certainly more lore-driven than the last one was. We get a lot more, like, how the universe works, which, there's like 15 books in this series written over 40 years, so things get pretty crazy, and eventually there's like witches and stuff, so anyways, this is a good book, and there's a lot to it, so if you're looking for an interest, as much as interests are cringe, this is a good one. Just please read this book so I have someone to talk to, because my family is killing me, and do I necessarily want to talk about gay smut with my dad? No. So thank you, bye!